The rain had stopped an hour earlier, but the grass on the ridge was still slick with it, and a Japanese infantryman crouched in the tree line below would later tell his interrogators something that no textbook about the Pacific War ever bothered to repeat. He said that in China he had learned what a battlefield sounded like. He said that on this ridge, in the dark, he learned what it sounded like when men who were supposed to break simply refused to. That single unremarkable sentence, spoken by a prisoner nobody thought was important enough to name, is the reason this story exists. Because history remembers the flag on Iwo Jima. History remembers the tide of red water at Tarawa. History has built entire mythologies around battles fought 2 and 3 years later, with better cameras and bigger budgets and generals who understood the value of a good photograph. But in September of 1942, on a bare grass spine of high ground south of an airfield nobody outside the Navy Department could have found on a map, a battalion of American Marines who called themselves Raiders did something that should have been impossible, and the men who tried to kill them were the first to say so. This is not a story about American propaganda dressed up as history. It is the opposite. It is a story assembled almost entirely from the words of the men who lost, because the men who lost were, in their own strange and reluctant way, more honest about what happened on that ridge than anyone who was cheering for the winning side. Before the sun rose on the 14th of September 1942, soldiers of an empire that had just finished humiliating the armies of Britain, France and the Netherlands across half of Asia would be crawling backward through the jungle, leaderless, starving, and quietly telling each other that the Americans on that hill were not what they had been promised. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the men climbing that ridge actually believed about themselves. The brigade, commanded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, had not lost a fight in months. It had marched the length of the Malay Peninsula and helped force the surrender of a British garrison 3 times its size at Singapore. An event so shocking to the Western world that Winston Churchill himself called it the worst disaster in British military history. Kawaguchi's men had fought in the jungles of Borneo. They believed with the flat certainty of veterans who had never been proven wrong that no Western army could match them in close country after dark. One of his officers, describing the mood of the brigade before it moved against the airfield the Americans called Henderson Field, later admitted to something close to contempt. In his own words, roughly translated from a post-war account, he said that his men had beaten a British Empire in 70 days, and that the Americans, softer and less disciplined, would not require nearly that long. He was not being cruel, he was simply repeating what every man in that brigade had been told, and what most of them believed. The Americans, in the Japanese assessment of the summer of 1942, were a nation of factory workers and shopkeepers who had not fought a serious land war in a generation. They had superior industry. Nobody in Kawaguchi's headquarters denied that. What they doubted, sincerely and almost universally, was whether American infantry could stand and fight at close range at night without the machines and the numbers that made their reputation. The ridge south of the airfield was where that question would be answered, and the men chosen to answer it were not ordinary infantry. That confidence was not built on ignorance of American resistance. It survived in spite of a warning the Japanese army itself had already received and largely refused to understand. 3 weeks before Kawaguchi's brigade reached the ridge, a separate Japanese force under Colonel Kayanao Ichiki had attacked a stretch of the same marine perimeter along a sandbar at the mouth of a river the Americans called the Tenaru. Ichiki's men, confident of an easy victory against what their own intelligence described as a demoralized garrison, walked directly into prepared American machine gun positions in the open and were destroyed almost to the last man in a single morning. It should have been the clearest possible evidence that the Marines defending this island intended to stand and fight. Instead, within Japanese headquarters, the disaster was explained away as the result of one impatient officer's recklessness rather than any real measure of American capability. Kawaguchi himself reportedly studied the failure and concluded that Ichiki had simply attacked without proper reconnaissance, in daylight, across open ground, mistakes he had no intention of repeating. What he did not question was the underlying assumption that had sent Ichiki forward in the first place, the belief that the men on the other side of the line would break once seriously pressed. He would carry that same unexamined belief up the grass slope of the ridge 3 weeks later. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion had been built for exactly this kind of fight. Its commander, a stocky, sunburned officer from Vermont named Merritt Edson, had spent years hunting guerrillas in the jungles of Nicaragua before this war ever began, and the men under him called him Red Mike, partly for the color of what remained of his hair, and partly because there was something almost feral in the way he approached combat. Edson did not believe in comfortable defensive lines. When he selected the ridge as his position, his own staff thought he had lost his mind, because the ground was open, grassy, and utterly without cover, a stretch of high ground that any conventional officer would have called a death trap. Edson looked at the same ground and saw a killing field, but he intended for the killing to run in the other direction. Beside him stood a major from Iowa named Kenneth Bailey, a quieter man, less theatrical than Edson, the kind of officer enlisted men trusted precisely because he never seemed to be performing for them. Between the two of them, roughly 800 raiders, along with a battalion of paratroopers already worn thin from an earlier raid across the water, dug in along a ridge that looked, from the Japanese side of the tree line, like the easiest objective in the entire campaign. Among the roughly 800 men waiting on that ridge was a private in one of the forward rifle companies, a 19-year-old from a farm town in Ohio who appears in a fellow raider's letter home only by his first name, Walt. The rest of his identity lost to time the way so much of this battle has been. He had joined the Marine Corps less than a year earlier and had never fired a shot at another human being before that night. In the letter describing him, a friend recalled that Walt had been sick with nerves in the hours before the attack began, unable to eat, convinced in a quiet way that he would not survive what was coming. He survived. What the letter does not explain, and what no surviving record can fully explain, is what carried a frightened teenager with almost no combat experience through a night that broke soldiers 3 times his age on the other side of the wire. Multiplied across 800 men, most of them just as young, just as inexperienced, that same unexplainable thing is very close to the actual answer to the question this story is built around. On the night of the 12th of September, the Japanese tested that assumption with a probing attack against a spur of high ground the Marines had nicknamed the Grassy Knoll. It was meant to be reconnaissance in force, a way of finding the seams in the American line before the main assault the following night. Instead, it became the first small piece of evidence that something about this position was different. A Marine company fell back under pressure, exactly as Edson wanted, luring the probing force forward, and Japanese soldiers, who advanced expecting a broken line instead, walked into interlocking fire from positions they had not known existed. One survivor of that first night's fighting, a corporal in a forward platoon, wrote in a letter recovered later that the Americans on the hill seemed to be waiting for them, that every step forward was answered before it was finished. It was a small warning. Kawaguchi did not listen to it. The next night, the 13th of September, was the one that mattered. It began just after dark with a sound the defenders would describe for the rest of their lives, a kind of rising murmur from the tree line below the ridge that resolved, as it grew closer, into voices. Kawaguchi had ordered his men to advance under cover of a coordinated attack by 3 battalions, moving from different directions, a plan that looked elegant on a map drawn in a headquarters tent and fell apart almost immediately in the reality of jungle at night. One of his battalions, moving through unmapped terrain in pitch darkness, lost its bearings entirely and never reached its assigned position in time to fight at all. The men who did arrive came forward in the classic pattern Japanese infantry doctrine had used, with devastating effect against poorly prepared defenders across Asia for a decade. Probing attacks to find weak points, followed by concentrated pushes with bayonets fixed, officers at the front, and a deliberate use of noise and confusion meant to break the nerve of the enemy before contact was even made. Whistles. Shouted commands. Something that Marine survivors remembered as bugle calls, cutting through the dark, though accounts differ on exactly what instrument produced the sound. What nobody disputes is the psychological weight of it, a deliberate wall of noise rolling up the slope ahead of men with rifles and grenades, designed to make defenders believe they were facing far greater numbers than they actually were, and in many earlier battles across the Pacific, it had worked exactly as intended. It did not work on the ridge. What happened instead, according to accounts pieced together from both sides after the war, was closer to controlled slaughter than to a battle in the conventional sense. Edson had arranged his artillery support with unusual precision for the period, working with battery commanders to pre-register the open ground in front of the ridge so that shells could be called down within 100 meters of his own foxholes, a tactic that terrified some of his own men nearly as much as it terrified the attackers. When the main assault came pouring up the grass slope in the dark, American howitzers began dropping high-explosive rounds directly onto the attacking waves, close enough that Marines in forward positions could feel the shockwave through the ground beneath them. A Japanese officer who survived that barrage, describing it decades later, said that his men had walked into artillery fire heavier and more accurate than anything they had experienced in China, and that entire sections of the attacking line simply ceased to exist in the space of a few minutes. For the men actually living through it, none of this registered as strategy. It registered as noise and light and the particular, disorienting terror of not knowing whether the next sound was outgoing or incoming. Marines in forward foxholes described the sensation of shells passing low overhead toward the enemy as something between relief and horror. A violence so close, it blurred the line between protection and danger. On the other side of that same barrage, Japanese soldiers advancing into it experienced something considerably worse, artillery falling directly among men who had nowhere to dig in and no choice but to keep moving forward, because stopping in the open ground was its own kind of death. One surviving account describes soldiers simply lying flat in the grass between explosions, unable to advance or retreat, waiting for a pause in the shelling that, for many of them, never came in time. For the Marines holding the ridge itself, the night became a blur of close-range fighting that modern infantry rarely experiences. Ammunition ran low within hours. Men who had emptied their magazines fought with bayonets, with knives in some documented cases with their bare hands, grappling with attackers in shallow foxholes barely deep enough to offer cover. Edson himself walked the line under fire, refusing repeated suggestions from his own staff that he move to a safer position, reportedly telling one platoon that was preparing to fall back that there was nowhere behind them worth retreating to, and that the only difference between the enemy and themselves was who still had the will to keep fighting. Whether every word of that exchange survives exactly as spoken is impossible to verify, but multiple Marines who served under him that night independently described the same core moment. An officer walking upright through incoming fire, ordering exhausted men back into positions they had every reason to abandon. Kenneth Bailey led one of the counterattacks that restored a section of the line the Japanese had briefly broken through, moving forward under fire with wounds he did not stop to treat, an action that would later earn him the Medal of Honor, alongside Edson himself. Survivors described a moment near the center of the position where Japanese soldiers had actually crested the ridge and briefly held ground inside the American perimeter. Close enough that some of the fighting there was hand-to-hand in the truest sense of the phrase, men grappling in darkness without knowing for certain whose uniform they had grabbed until it was too late for either of them to reconsider. None of this happened by accident, and understanding why the ridge held requires looking past the individual courage of the men who defended it and toward the machinery that supported them. Edson had spent the days before the attack walking the ground with his artillery liaison officers, plotting exact coordinates for every approach a Japanese assault could reasonably take, a level of preparation between infantry and supporting guns that was still unusual in 1942. When the attack came, forward observers could call fire missions by referencing prearranged concentration numbers rather than shouting coordinates under pressure, shaving critical seconds off the time between a request and a barrage landing exactly where it was needed. On the Japanese side, the plan that looked coherent in a headquarters tent required 3 separate battalions moving through jungle with inadequate maps and no reliable communication between units to arrive at the same place at nearly the same time. One officer from the battalion that lost its way entirely that night later admitted that his men had spent hours moving in what he believed was the correct direction, only to find themselves, near dawn, nowhere near the fighting at all, a failure of navigation that removed roughly a third of the intended attacking force from the battle before it ever began. The Marines on the ridge did not know that. From their foxholes, the assault already felt overwhelming enough. What makes this night different from countless other desperate defensive stands scattered across military history is not simply that the Marines held. It is what the men on the other side said about it afterward, because unlike so many battle claims that exist only in the words of the victors, the testimony validating what happened on that ridge comes overwhelmingly from Japanese sources. Men who had every reason to minimize or explain away their defeat, and instead, in private letters, in post-war interviews, in memoirs written decades later, without any audience left to impress, described an enemy that had genuinely surprised them. One infantryman, writing home before his own death later in the campaign, described the ridge as a place where the Americans fought like men who had already accepted they would die there, and said that nothing in his previous experience of combat had prepared him for infantry that kept firing after their positions were clearly overrun. Another account from a junior officer who survived the retreat into the jungle afterward admitted that his men had expected the Americans to break the way so many defenders across Asia had broken in the preceding years, and that when they did not, something in the confidence of the entire brigade cracked along with the assault itself. By the time the sky began to lighten on the morning of the 14th of September, the grass slope below the ridge was covered with Japanese dead in numbers that estimates place at somewhere above 800 men, against Marine losses that, while serious, numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds. Kawaguchi's brigade, an outfit that had never known defeat, broke apart into small groups, retreating through jungle without adequate food, harassed by artillery fire, called in on their own retreating columns, some of them wandering for days before reaching friendly lines in a physical condition that shocked the officers who eventually received them. Kawaguchi himself was relieved of further offensive responsibility not long afterward, and post-war accounts describe a commander who understood almost immediately what had happened to his reputation and his brigade in a single night on a ridge he had expected to take in hours. He had come to Guadalcanal carrying the confidence of Singapore, of Malaya, of an unbroken record against Western armies that the entire military culture of his nation had assured him would continue indefinitely. He left the ridge having learned, in the most brutal way a professional soldier can learn anything, that the assumption underlying his entire campaign, the assumption that American infantry would not stand and fight at close range in the dark, was simply wrong. The methods proven on that ridge did not disappear with the battle itself. The close coordination between infantry and artillery that Edson had insisted on, unusual enough in 1942 to draw skepticism from his own superiors, became a template studied and repeated in Marine operations across the rest of the Pacific campaign, from the jungles of New Georgia to the coral of Peleliu. Within the small insular culture of the raider battalions themselves, the ridge became something closer to scripture. The battle new recruits were told about before their first combat, proof that a numerically inferior force with the right preparation and the right leadership could withstand an assault that should, by any conventional military logic, have overrun them. For the Japanese army, the lessons were absorbed far more quietly, filtered through a military culture that treated failure as a subject for private shame rather than public analysis. Kawaguchi's own account of the battle, written years afterward, carries the careful, understated language of a man who understood exactly what he had lost that night and had no intention of dwelling publicly on the details. A silence that, in its own way, says as much about what happened on the ridge as any surviving testimony from the men he commanded. The strategic consequences of that single night extended far beyond the ridge itself. Henderson Field, the airstrip that Ridge existed to protect, remained in American hands, and the aircraft that flew from it over the following weeks and months went on to strangle Japanese efforts to resupply and reinforce their own forces on Guadalcanal, a slow bleeding that historians now widely regard as one of the true turning points of the entire Pacific War. Had the ridge fallen on the 13th of September, the airfield almost certainly falls with it, and the trajectory of the following 3 years of fighting across the Pacific becomes difficult to predict with any confidence at all. And yet ask most people today what happened at Guadalcanal, and you will get, at best, a vague sense of jungle fighting and a long grinding campaign. Ask about the ridge specifically, and the overwhelming majority of people, including many with a genuine interest in the history of the war, will have nothing to offer at all. There is no photograph from that night that became a national symbol. There is no flag raised at dawn for a combat photographer to capture. The men who held that position did so in darkness, in mud, in a fight too chaotic and too intimate to be reduced to a single clean image, and history, which rewards clean images more often than it rewards the truth, largely moved on without them. What remains, instead, is testimony. Not medals, though medals were earned and given. Not monuments, though a modest one exists on the ground itself for those who go looking for it. What remains is the voice of an enemy who had every incentive to lie about what happened on that ridge, and instead, again and again, across letters and interrogations and memoirs written long after there was anything left to gain from honesty, described an American infantry unit that refused to behave the way their doctrine, their experience, and their entire understanding of the war had told them it would. A prisoner taken in the days after the battle, asked by his interrogators what he had expected to find on that ridge, reportedly answered that he had expected an enemy that would run once the fighting became difficult, because that was what he had been told about Americans, and that what he found instead was an enemy that seemed to fight harder the more difficult the fighting became. It is a small, almost throwaway line in a stack of wartime interrogation reports that few people ever bother to read. But it captures, more precisely than any official history could manage, exactly what changed on that ridge in the space of a single night. The empire that sent Kiyotake Kawaguchi's brigade up that slope believed it already knew how the story would end. The men who survived that belief, crawling back through the jungle in the grey light of the following morning, understood that they had learned something the rest of their army had not yet caught up to. Long before Iwo Jima, long before Tarawa, long before the photographs that would eventually define this war in the public imagination, a battalion nobody outside the Marine Corps had ever heard of held a bare ridge above an obscure airfield, and the soldiers who tried and failed to take it from them were the ones who first told the world, in their own words, exactly what that meant.